Okay, I'm going to test my own microphone. Looks like that's good. Good evening if you've just walked in. Welcome to Sit Tight. Kick off at 6 o'clock. Good evening to those of you who have just come in. We'll get started closer to 6 o'clock. So if you haven't already, grab a cup of tea, sit back, relax. We'll get started shortly. Once again, good evening to those of you who have just come in. We'll get started closer to 6 o'clock. All right, good evening to those of you who have just come in. It is 6 o'clock now, so I'll make a slow start, although I'm sure I'll be bringing in people who are still joining. So welcome to tonight's subjects selection seminar. My name is Larissa. I'm the head of teaching and learning here at Dymocks and Talent 100. Just a little bit about me. I've been working here, goodness gracious me, since I think the end of 2019. Started off as a tutor and have since moved on to management. In terms of what I did at uni, I myself have completed a law degree and commerce degree at Sydney University. Also have a graduate diploma in legal practice, and I'm here to impart all my knowledge with you today. So we'll see how we go. Looking forward to it. Okay, cool. So let's slowly make a start. Just a few things in terms of what we'll be covering today, and also just a few little housekeeping things as well. We'll start off today with unpacking the ATAR, okay, in terms of how your ATAR is calculated, how your subjects work, how scaling works. And we'll go into quite a bit of detail on that. That way you've got the information you need to make the best choices. We'll then talk a little bit about choosing subjects and the scaling for each subject as well. We'll cover maths, English, science, and also humanities subjects using latest UAC admissions data from last year. We'll also talk a bit about subjects as well, such as languages, also a few other easy subjects as well in the broader remit, just so you've got that information with scaling as well and how to best go about choosing those. Then we'll impart you with some general do's and don'ts for how you should go about your year 10 and year 11 studies as well. Long story short, we don't want year 12 to be the year we start thinking about all of this and start preparing as well. And then, of course, we'll leave in some time for some Q&A. Just a little note, I'll pause at the end of each section just to answer any questions. You're more than welcome to drop a few questions in the chat, but once again, I won't get to those until I get to the end of each section in the presentation. That way, we're just not scrambling between presentation and chat message. Okay, thank you very much. And also a huge welcome to those of you who have come in. Here's the agenda for today, and we'll get started with part 1. Okay. Before we do, it's worth reflecting on this quote from our education team here. The HSC is not a test of pure intelligence. It is a test of competitiveness, your ability to combine natural talent with preparedness, hard work, and performance under pressure. Like any game, you can succeed much more if you know the rules. Now, there's a few things to unpack here, okay? Yes, of course, knowing your stuff in your subject and also having perhaps talent, say, with English or science or whatever is important. But in the HSC, what also is very decisive in how you succeed is not only the work you're putting in, but also technique and understanding how things work and knowing the rules. And that's really the primary purpose of today's seminar, to give you the rules, the framework for how things work, so you can make sure that you're making the best choices regarding your subjects, and then in turn the best choices moving into university as well. So moving on to section 1, here we'll get into the rules of your HSC in terms of subjects, units, scaled marks, and how this all combines into this overall grand result called your ATAR. So starting off with picking subjects and units, just some basic information. The short of it is there's 3 important numbers here, 12, 10, and 10. So basically what happens is in year 11, and I'll also make some annotations on the slides as well, NESA prescribes that you must do 12 units worth of subjects at an absolute minimum, okay, mandatory. English is also mandatory for your HSC. There was talk about maths being mandatory, but it is no longer mandatory. They scaled that back. So if you're still hearing talks of that for whatever reason, no, it's not true. That said, we'd still recommend maths. Anyway, so for year 11, for your preliminary course, once again, 12 units of subjects are mandatory. English is mandatory. A number of students sit 12 units exactly, although a few students opt to do 13 units. We then go to year 12. In year 12, only 10 units are compulsory, and NESA prescribes that. This includes English, okay? So of course we can still drop a subject between years 11 and 12, just making sure it's not English. Okay, that said, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail later, many top students still keep a spare unit or two just for insurance in case something goes wrong with one of their subjects for whatever reason. So once again, year 11, 12 units, year 12, only 10 units are compulsory. Then what UAC, a separate organization, University Admission Centre, does is they take your best 10 units of all the subjects you sat in your HSC. Okay, and this always includes English. So you can see English is mandatory throughout. So English is very, very important. What the implication there is, if you do more than 10 units for year 12, NESA only takes your best 10, so any weaker subjects are dropped out. So that's a bit about how picking subjects and units work. Once again, 3 important numbers, 12, 10, and 10. Here's an example of a course load. Okay, so say we have a student doing year 11 total units for their HSC. They're doing English Advanced, they're doing Maths Advanced, Maths Extension 1 and Maths Extension 2. Collectively, these 3 maths subjects, Advanced, Extension 1, Extension 2, those are regarded all together what constitute 4-unit maths, which you might have heard. Reason being, of course, Maths Advanced is a 2-unit course, Extension 1 is a 1-unit course, and then Extension 2 is also a 1-unit course. A student doing Extension 2 needs to do Advanced and Extension 1 as prerequisites. Okay, moving forward from maths, we have this student. They're also doing chemistry, they're doing modern history, and then they've picked up history extension in year 12. So altogether, they've got 11 units with 1 unit as insurance, as you like, should something go wrong. And the ATAR, of course, as we've discussed, uses your best 10 units of the lot. So we've spoken a bit about subject requirements, how many units for year 11, year 12. We're now going to talk a bit about, okay, we've done all our assessments. How do we get, or how does NESA get the overall HSC marks at the end of year 12? And the gist of it is that your HSC mark is the average of your school assessment marks. So that's all your school assessment marks, including any exams, quizzes, half yearlies, trial exams, whatever. And also your HSC exam result itself. That HSC exam being the paper that students sit in October of year 12. So once again, half school assessed coursework, half HSC exam coursework. NESA takes the average of those, and that is what gets you your HSC mark for each subject. Now, there's one important caveat we need to make with the school assessment marks. NESA doesn't just take our raw assessment marks altogether. NESA takes what we call a moderated school assessment mark and uses that to make your overall HSC mark. And we'll talk about what moderation means in a second. But before I do, I also wanted to make just one final important point regarding this. We can see that the HSC exam alone, okay, so once again, the exam that students sit at the end of October, that constitutes 50% of your marks alone. So it's a very, very, very significant piece of assessment. And once again, it's really why students need to be building up to this quite early on, so they absolutely nail this piece of assessment. Okay, I'll pause there. Does anyone have any questions so far? I'll just keep the chat open. But if you do, feel free to pop them through. In the meantime, what we'll do is we'll keep talking about moderation. Okay, so with moderation, once again, I've said that with the school assessed marks, NESA takes what's called a moderated mark, okay? Not your raw school assessment marks, i.e. the exact marks a student scored. They do a bit of comparison and moderation with that. And let's unpack what this means. So here on this slide, we've got a worked example of what moderation actually entails. But first, let's understand what moderation actually does. The gist of it is this. If we have two students and say both students are performing at the same ability, so they're both quite bright, say that one student sits a paper for the same subject at school A, that school sets easier assessment tasks, so that student gets 90%. Let's say that another student, once again, same ability as previous student in school A, they go to school B, they sit assessments and they get 80%, same subject. It shouldn't be the case that the student who got 90% in school A with easier assessments ends up being deemed as perhaps having a better overall HSC mark than the student from school B because the assessments are of different difficulty. So what NESA does in this case is they say, we'll use the HSC exam as a benchmark of how students perform. If students perform significantly better than their HSC mark for the exam, then NESA will say, well, chances are the school's assessments were set a little bit too easy, so they'll bring the student's assessment mark down. Conversely, it also swings the other way. Say the student did really, really well in their HSC mark, but their overall school assessment mark was lower. NESA will then bring up or moderate up their student's school assessment mark so it suits the HSC mark. So we have a few examples of that happening in this table over here. And let's take a bit of time just to unpack that a little bit so we understand what's going on. So we'll start by looking at Alex in the first row. So we've got Alex, his raw assessment mark is 95%, so that's what he scored in his school assessments. He did quite well. However, his HSC mark is only 85%. So then what NESA does is they moderate down the school assessment mark from 95 to 85. And then his final assessment mark ends up being 85% because it's the average of both the exam and the moderated assessment mark. So continuing, let me just admit this, pardon me. Continuing through to Emma, similar story as well. Okay, let me just erase those boxes as well for you, just so we can see a little bit clearer. Same with Emma as well. She scored 88% raw in her school assessments. In the HSC exam, she's only scored 82%. That's been moderated, or NESA has then moderated the raw school assessment mark down to 81. And so her final mark is the average of 81, the moderated assessment mark, and the exam mark 82%, so then 81.5. Now, with Ben, who comes after, oops, cleared all that, okay. With Ben, who comes afterwards, okay, we can see he's a case of where his raw mark is lower than his exam mark. So then his raw mark is 70%, exam mark 76%. So then NESA's gone, okay, chances are school assessments were a little bit too difficult. So then his raw school assessment mark has been moderated up to 76 to match the HSC exam mark. And then the final mark, once again, that being the average of the exam mark, and the moderated mark is also 76%. So that's an example of how moderation works. So once again, the key takeaway from that is that NESA makes a fair comparison of assessment marks by school. And the way they do that is by comparing where students landed in their school assessments against the HSC exam, with the HSC exam being the common assessment that students will sit. They all sit the same paper with the same questions on the same day at the same time, moderated by NESA exam invigilators. And it's that comparison of school assessment marks against that HSC exam mark that produces our moderated mark here. Okay, so we've spoken about moderation, and I'll just sit back to the previous slide just for those who came in, just so they can see the broader picture. So once again, so far we've spoken about choosing units. Year 11, 12 units required. Year 12, only 10 units of subjects required. That said, we suggest doing 1 or 2 more units just for a bit of insurance. In terms of how NESA calculates HSC exam marks, 50% of your moderated school assessment mark, once again, moderation following that process we just explored together, and the other 50% being the student's HSC exam mark formed from the HSC exam that students sat or sit in October at the end of year 12 after all their trials and graduation, et cetera, et cetera. The average of both of those are taken, and that is what comes, spits out the HSC mark for each subject. Okay. So we've spoken about the HSC mark and how NESA gets that. Now the next piece of the puzzle is really putting together how do we end up getting from HSC marks to students having this magical ATAR at the end of everything, and then that ATAR being used to determine which university courses they can do. So the process is as follows. So firstly, as we've discussed, NESA determines the HSC marks, and once again, and I'll keep repeating just in case anyone misses, moderated school assessment mark, HSC exam mark, average of those, you get your single HSC mark altogether. What happens next is a separate admission center, UAC, University Admission Center, so separate to NESA. UAC then takes all your HSC marks, of course, for every single student. And what they do is they adjust these marks according to the relative academic strength of each subject's cohort. And they produce what's called a scaled mark. Now, let me just unpack that a little bit more. So point 2 is best explained through maybe a bit of an example. So say we've got a student doing Maths Extension 2, so the hardest maths course of the New South Wales curriculum. Say they end up scoring 80%, okay? Now, Maths Extension 2, very, very strong cohort, the best and brightest students in all of maths. Say another student studying Maths Advanced, Maths Standard, say that student scores 80% as well. Now, on paper, you might go, okay, well, it's 80% and 80%, well, students score the same. Well, not quite, because the courses have different difficulties. You're also competing against a much stronger and more competitive cohort in Maths Extension 2. So then what the whole scaling process is, it's a way of NESA comparing apples with apples rather than apples with oranges. They work this through and go, okay, considering all the relative strengths of the cohort and the difficulty of the subject, what would you have gotten or where would you be? And that's how they produce that scaled mark. And we'll talk a bit more about scaling shortly. There's a few misconceptions around how it works, whether it benefits you, whether it doesn't, and we'll get into that shortly. So the short of it for now is that's what works with scaling. Once again, it's UAC's way of very much adjusting students' marks and saying, okay, how can we compare students appropriately given the relative difficulty and strength of the cohorts across different subjects? So after UAC has done all of that, they then give you your ATAR. Now, you can think of your ATAR as more of a score, more of a ranking rather, not a score. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Your ATAR is very much, once again, your best 10 units. UAC then produces an aggregate or total out of 500 from that, and then converts that to a percentile rank. So for instance, if you scored an ATAR of 95, it means that you performed better than 95% of students in New South Wales, or flipped differently, you performed in the top 5% of the state. Another example, say that you scored 98, means you performed better than 98% of the cohort, or flipped once again in the top 2% of all of New South Wales. If you scored 99, well done to you, scored better than 99% of everyone, or once again, flips differently in the top 1% of that cohort. So once again, ATAR is a ranking, it's not a score. What's the purpose of all of this? It tells universities where exactly students sit and therefore who's eligible for their university courses. So the ATAR is important. Understanding minimum ATAR cutoffs or selection ranks, etc., for university courses is important, and we'll talk about that a little bit more throughout today's seminar. Okay, so we've spoken about that process. So once again, we first have the HSC mark, which NESA comes up with. We then have UAC, which does its own scaling process, comes up with a scaled mark for each student, for each subject, and then the ATAR. I want to unpack scaling in a little bit more detail just so we can understand what it actually is. So there's a misconception that, okay, if I choose a higher scaling subject like maths extension or English extension or chemistry, then that means that it'll turn a very bad score in that subject to a really, really good score. And the short answer is that's not quite true, because the way I want you to think about scaling is as follows. Think about two 100-meter races. Let's say that in the first race, you finish that race in 14 seconds, but that race is against the slowest students in your school or class or wherever. Let's say you run a separate race, so race B. That race this time, you still finish in 14 seconds, but instead that race is run against the New South Wales State running squad. So in other words, the best and fastest runners in the state. The question then is, okay, well, which cohort did you perform better in? And obviously it's the second, because relative to that cohort, performing mid-pack against the New South Wales best in the state running squad is still a very significant achievement. In fact, the bigger achievement here than, say, coming first out of the slowest students in your school. So applying that sort of intuition, this is how UAC handles scaling. So you can see in this graph over here, let me just make sure I'm annotating it down here, based off UAC data, which you can see the source at the bottom. What we've got is a rank of subjects, from subjects that scale the most to subjects that scale the least, just out of this set, although there's other subjects we could have included that haven't been included here. Now, let's just unpack a few other terms as well. We've got this thing called 2025 HSC per unit scaled means, and those are shown for each subject here. So what does this actually mean in practice? So we can see for maths extension 2, the per unit scaled mean, i.e. that scaled mean mark for all students who have sat the maths extension 2 HSC is 43.4%. So basically it's a summary statistic to say, okay, if we got everyone in maths extension 2 and lined them all up, then smack bang in the middle, the average person would have gotten this mark. Compare that to, say, maths standard 2, okay, where if we did the same process, okay, line everyone up, go and find the person right in the middle, that person only would have gotten 23.3 out of 50. So what does this actually mean in practice? Well, it clearly means that our Maths Extension 2 cohort performs much stronger. The average person would have scored around 43.4, whereas Maths Standard 2 only scores 23.3. So then UAC takes that into account and says, okay, if you're the average student in Maths Extension 2, you still did pretty well compared to, other students doing lower subjects. So these summary statistics and scaling, it's more of just a reference point for UAC to use. What it doesn't mean is this. Say I'm a Maths Extension 2 student and I really want to do that course. I've heard, it scales really, really well. However, I score, say, 20% on average in my assessments. Scaling's not really going to say, okay, my 20% will turn into this magical higher score. It doesn't work like that, okay? Because the benefit of doing these higher scaling subjects to begin with is the fact that you're a high achiever yourself. And so it's not that you're being pulled towards that higher mark per se, it's that by definition, you're a high achiever and the entire distribution of marks typically sits a lot higher for high achievers in high achieving subjects compared to low achievers in low achieving subjects. And UAC takes all of that into account when coming up with your ATAR and your ranking everywhere else. So in other words, another analogy to think about this is to say how you perform academically in a subject is the engine of your ATAR, of your subjects, et cetera, et cetera. Scaling is just the multiplier to say, oh, you're very impressive for doing this subject to UAC, okay? You don't do a subject just to multiply something. You don't choose it for the multiplier. You don't have anything to multiply if you're not performing well in that subject to begin with. You pick subjects because you can perform well in them. So for instance, you can perform well in Maths Extension 2 or Maths Extension 1 or even English Extension. And you don't choose them just because you say, oh, they're going to improve my results automatically just by choosing them, because that's not true. So there's a few things we need to unpack from that in terms of what does this mean in terms of choosing your subjects to begin with. And that's what we're going to get into in section 2. Before I do that, I might just pause to see if anyone's had any questions in the webinar. Not yet. Okay, perfect. Okay, let's move on then to 3 critical steps or things to think about with subject selection. So now we've got the information. So once again, just recapping, 12 units are needed in year 11, only 10 are needed for year 12, but we suggest doing slightly more than 10 as insurance. Your HSC mark is the average of both your moderated school assessment and your HSC exam. Scaling is the process by which NESA accurately ranks students according to the strength of their cohort, et cetera, et cetera. How do we translate all of that into, okay, what subject do I choose, or what do I do tomorrow, or what do I do as soon as I, finish this call? And the short of it is this. Can't emphasize this enough. Choose the right subjects for you. So don't choose a subject because it's a higher scaling subject or because, the entire group cohort is doing that. It's important that you know where your strengths are at, where your weaknesses are at, and then you play to those and use scaling and everything to your advantage that way. So in sum, there are no right or wrong subjects, only right for you ones based on your interests, what you're strong at, and also, more importantly, what you want to do at university. What we really suggest you do, and you can look at university websites or UAC publishes guides as well, anchor what subjects you choose in interests beyond year 12. So for instance, if I were doing perhaps engineering, then I'd want to very much use Maths Extension, perhaps maybe physics or chemistry or something like that. If I was doing perhaps more of a social sciences degree, perhaps English, maybe modern history or something like that, maybe a legal studies. If I'm doing business, probably at least Maths Advanced, and then maybe even business or maybe even legal studies as well. So in short, we're working backwards from what you want to do, not what everyone else wants to do, or other plans that perhaps other people might have for you, which is all fine. It's very much what excites you and what interests you, and that's where you're working backwards to make your subject selections. If you're not too sure about what you want to do just yet, that's perfectly fine. At least think about, well, are you more of a writing person or a maths person or a science person? And then you can work out from there and go, okay, maybe this course or this course or this course, and then work backwards to choose your subjects from there. Other thing as well, which we've reinforced consistently, would you rather perform exceptionally in a lower scaling subject, perhaps one that you enjoy a little bit more, or decently, maybe poorly in a higher scaling one? And this one resonates with me in particular because back when I did my HSC 2018, so a little time ago, about 8 years, in year 11, I remember my maths extension, one cohort had, I think, about 21 students in it. That cohort dropped down to 7, 8 students in year 12. And why is that? Because a number of students had the view that, oh, I've got to do maths extension, it's hard, wow, there's a bit of gravitas towards it, etc., etc. But they didn't have the skills to do that subject. They all performed much better, when they dropped to Maths Advanced. It suited them, suited their interests a lot more. And most importantly, the time commitment behind trying to perform well in a subject that's become your worst nightmare, that time could have been spent elsewhere getting really, really good at another subject. So we're also thinking about things here in terms of opportunity cost. Could you spend the time better elsewhere in a subject you enjoy or somewhere else, and bring up your marks that way, as opposed to absolutely struggling through a subject that you've just chosen because of scaling and not because you have any real interest in it? And that's really much what the last point is hinting at as well. Performance, your interest in the subject, motivation for it trumps scaling any time. Okay, so once again, that's step number 1. Choosing the right subjects for you. Might sound easy in practice, but really there's a lot to unpack from that. Step number 2 is, okay, sure, you might have an idea of what subjects you're doing. Always go and check your syllabus for each of the subjects. Just a few things, I guess, on a per subject basis. For maths, we often say, take the highest level of maths that you're capable of. So say if you're going, okay, I could do Maths Advanced, but maybe I might be a little bit more comfortable in Standard, we'd always say, well, try Maths Advanced in year 11, just keep your options open, and then, you can see how that goes. Then you can always drop back to Standard in year 12 if you need to. But either way, just make sure that we keep our options open. So for maths, straight away, we would say, pick the highest level that you're genuinely capable of. But once again, noting all the caveats I mentioned previously. As for English, Advanced and Standard, it's very much the same thing. Advanced has compulsory Shakespeare. If you don't like Shakespeare or cannot perform well in it and don't want to put in the time to get better at Shakespeare, then Standard is probably your gig. And I'll chat about Standard a little bit more in the coming slides. Of course, sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, all very, very different subjects. Biology being very content heavy and dense. Physics, chemistry, much more calculation-based, particularly since they changed the syllabus in 2019, start of 2019. So if we're doing physics, chemistry, we really want to make sure we're confident in maths as well. Once again, there's the link to the syllabus, and make sure that we've got that booked mark as well. Okay. Step number 3. So once again, we've spoken about choosing what works for you, also looking at the content of the subjects as well. And then the final thing is really just technique and also discipline oriented. It's very much using year 10 and sooner, ideally, but year 10 in particular, to start building those important study habits that will carry you through senior. So year 10 and year 11 is quite a jump. If you perhaps got through 7, 8, or lucky enough to get through 7, 8, 9, and 10 just coasting, that's not going to suit you well in year 11 when you've got much higher course load for the subjects compared to junior school, more expectations, more difficult assessments. So you're thrown in there. So then make sure that we are using year 10 just to practice those habits so we're not overwhelmed by year 11. The other part of it as well is most schools do allow subject changes into year 11 and even in year 12. So I've already hinted at one. For instance, if you started off with Maths Advanced and you went, okay, not for me, not performing as well, and you wanted to drop to standard, things like that actually happen. So then don't feel too panicked about going, oh goodness, I'm not sure if I've gotten everything 100% right here. It's a matter of going, let's keep my options open. Of course, put in the work for every single subject and then reflect and move on from there. As I mentioned previously, check your university prerequisites. So for instance, UNSW Engineering needs at least Maths Advanced, chances are Maths Extension 1. So go and look at your university prerequisites for courses that you'd want to do in years 11 and 12. You can find prerequisites on the UAC guides for each course or on university web pages as well. And finally, as we've hinted at already, if your plan is very much, I'll start taking things seriously in year 11, you're already behind a number of students who have really started putting in the work sooner than that. So next is just a little bit of a case study, I suppose, about how to think about subject selection a little bit more strategically. And this example works through all the main subject areas, so English, math, science, etc., etc. So with English, of course, at least 2 subjects compulsory. Key decision in year 11 is very much advanced, standard, or extension 1, should also be there too. And in year 12, students often pick up extension 2 as well, more of a later point there. In terms of what most students do, the bulk of students do advanced. It's actually a very, very strong cohort. So once again, only pick advanced if you can perform well in it. For maths as well, the key decision realistically in year 11, although once again, extension 2 starts biting a bit more in year 12, but we want to set the groundwork now. Advanced extension 1 or extension 2. You might want to consider standard, but once again, we'd suggest sticking with Maths Advanced if you can, and then you can always think about standard a little bit later. Science, that's up to you. Most students commonly do 2 sciences, whether it's biology, chemistry, physics, etc., etc. Humanities, once again, can pick that if you genuinely have a genuine interest in the subject. So business studies, legal studies, economics, history, etc., etc. Languages as well, technology subjects. We'll go through some of those later as well, but those are also options too. Okay, so final point on scaling before we start to pick up on each subject area specifically with some key tips. Strong cohorts scale up, as we've hinted at previously when we were discussing scaling as well. Maths Extension 2 being the highest performing cohort. So what this graph illustrates here is that a median Extension 2 student who's smack bang in the middle of the data scores 44.7. Compare that to physics, say a top 10 physics student in scoring above 90% of students, their scaled mark is 43.0. So what is this slide basically saying, apart from showing what we're talking about earlier with scaling? It's very much saying that if you can do these higher subjects and you can perform well in them, your scaling will actually kick in quite nicely for you, and scaling works there as well. You can see a scaled mark for the Maths Extension 2 student, even if they're just in the middle of that already very bright cohort, is higher than the scaled mark for a physics student who's in the top 90%. Quite the difference there. Okay. So those we've already gone through, so I won't do that again. So we'll now move on to some subject-specific tips, and I'm just checking the time. I'll make sure we allow some time for questions. So once again, just to recap, or keep recapping where we've gone in today's seminar, we've started off with a discussion about how the ATAR is actually calculated. So half moderated school assessment mark, then HSC mark. Spoken about scaling, where the important thing is there is not to choose just because a subject scales well, but to choose because you have the performance ability to do that subject. I'll now give you some subject-specific information. We'll start off with English, then maths, and then science, and then HSC, and then we'll wrap things up after that with a few little final tips. Okay. So talking about senior English here, so what can we expect from senior English? Like a lot of the HSC courses, it's a bit of a step up. So in Year 10, you might have done your usual literary analysis, reading, writing, maybe some textual analysis, a little bit of Shakespeare. It was very much teacher directed to see where things went. In Year 12, this is when we start to get a little bit deeper into things like historical context, also different types of prescribed writing. So for instance, an analytical piece of writing, in other words, an essay, creative writing, something called discursive writing, which is very much just a neutral discussion of a topic, and persuasive writing as well. Year 12 also has a specific on NESA mandated prescribed text. So for instance, 1984, etc., etc. The exams themselves are extended essay responses or imaginative pieces, etc., under timed conditions. And once again, we're getting really into integrating more detail into our English responses regarding historical context, context of the author, etc., etc. So once again, Year 10 and to Year 11 and Year 12, quite the step up from what we were doing previously in Year 10. Year 11 specifically, we're comparing just advanced and standard here, similar modules. They start off with reading to write, so no prescribed text in Year 11. So we start with reading to write. Advanced does two different modules, narratives that shape our world and a critical study of literature, and then standard, contemporary possibilities and a close study of literature. As regards the Year 12 course, both courses do a common module, text and human experiences, and this is where your prescribed texts will kick in. So schools will choose that for you. The advanced course does 3 other modules, textual conversations, another critical study of literature, and also a more, I guess, experimental module, I guess you could call it, called the craft of writing, where it's very much students explore how to write and the process of how to write. With standard English, we start off with language, identity and culture. We do a close study of literature, and we also conclude with the craft of writing, just with different texts than advanced. So as we've hinted at previously with the overlap between the texts, the different subjects, we've got common paper structure to both. So English for both standard and advanced, they both have 2 HSC papers. Paper 1 is that common module, so your text and human experiences we spoke to. That has 2 sections, an unseen comprehension section and an essay section. And then paper 2 has your 3 modules, and those are the 3 modules that we're exploring here. So what's important to note is both courses are actually still quite rigorous. So even if you choose standard, sure, you might not be doing the rigorous historical context and textual analysis as you do in advanced, but you've still got 2 HSC papers for both of those, with very, very tight time constraints around, how long you have to write each piece and complete each section of the paper. So either way, both courses are still very, very rigorous courses. And a student who's chosen standard should still expect to do quite a fair bit of work for it as well. So we've unpacked this throughout, so I won't go through it in too much more detail. But once again, English Advanced is really just expecting that higher order textual analysis. Standard, the texts are a little bit more accessible, but that said, our courses are overall still quite rigorous with the HSC component of them. We've got some further information here just regarding how each subject scales. So unsurprisingly, English Extension 1 and Extension 2, pardon me, I'll use the boxes. Now they scale higher. Reason for that being is that courses, the students doing those courses are typically the top students in English anyway, so it's sort of self-selection as well. English Advanced, modest scaling, and then Standard, less scale, doesn't scale as well. But of course, as I've spoken throughout today, the bonus with scaling only lands if you perform well in that English subject. So once again, it really is a question of choosing the right English course for you. So in terms of making that decision, am I an advanced English student or a standard English student? Here's 3 little things to think about. If you're sitting, looking at number 1, if you're sitting at more of a C level at English and you don't think you'll hit a band 6 or a band 5 in advanced, standard is probably something that's a little bit more comfortable for you. Once again, still rigorous, but put in the work and you'll be able to perform a lot better in it. Reading comprehension as well. These prescribed texts in Year 12 can be long. Okay, so if you struggle with long or complex texts, you're not going to have the right baseline knowledge to be able to sit the HSC exam. So standard more your gig. But if you absolutely love reading, then advanced extension 1 is your gig. And finally, as we've also discussed earlier, and I'll keep emphasizing this, the time cost. Once again, if the effort put in for you to do really well in standard might be used elsewhere to meaningfully improve performance in other subjects. So think about the time cost as well. How much effort would you have to put into to become really, really good at English Advanced and perform, you know, better than the course mean? And could that time be spent elsewhere a little bit better? So it's a matter of being strategic with what we choose. Okay, English Extension 1, I won't go into too much detail, just conscious of the time, but the short of it is choose it for the love of those subjects, not because they scale. The Extension 2 assessments in particular are quite rigorous. You're writing a long text or you're doing speeches, etc., etc. Okay, let's talk about maths, my favorite subject. So with maths, there's a few things to consider in terms of what maths course you should choose. Now, you'll notice I've got each of these here, 5.3, 5.2, and 5.1. They're all in brackets, I guess, quotation marks, because NESA doesn't adopt that formal terminology anymore, but I'll still use it because it still crops up and it's useful in helping to describe the pathway. Okay, so the short of it is this. If you're currently in your top maths perhaps level at school, you're doing 5.3 maths or harder pathways of maths topics, then we'd suggest that Extension 1, perhaps Extension 2 is your better bet. And as we've spoken about, those subjects have good scaling. If you're more of a 5.2, maybe on the verge of 5.3, probably suggest Maths Advanced is your better gig. You'll do a lot better in that. Anything that is 5.2, 5.1 related would suggest Standard is your better gig. So here's actually an important point to raise in the context of maths specifically. Students are put into Year 9 in maths classes based on their performance in 7 and 8. So you can see here how the consequences of how students perform and the effort they put in or something like that in 7 and 8 is instrumental here in determining what you do in 9 and 10, and then what options are better suited to you in years 11 and 12. So this slide really, apart from being helpful for Year 10s to understand where to go, it really is a slide for students starting Year 7 to say, here's the consequences of what you do in Year 7 and 8, whether you have all these options open for harder math subjects and fulfilling course prerequisites and by extension university courses. And it really is something to raise at the start of high school. So thought I'd emphasize that point here as well. So once again, the short of this slide is very much choose which math subject is appropriate for your needs and also your abilities. If you choose standard, well, it's still a relatively rigorous course in terms of content. We have a few tutors who have done standard maths here, some of whom I taught, and English standard even, who have gone on to study, education and science at UNSW, so great university. So what it is to say is, there's an example of, our tutors' subject choices really working for them and helping them get to where they wanted to go. Okay. Now, this slide very much goes through, okay, if we want to move between maths courses, so I've alluded to this briefly, I won't spend too much time on it, once again, just watching that clock tick down. So typically around term 4, year 10, a number of schools will run mock year 11 lessons. This is the best time just to get a feel for, say, if you're a bit unsure about standard or advanced, choose advanced, but if you attend that mock lesson and you go, maybe standard is better for me, then that's a great chance to drop. Another common window is around the end of year 11. Students get their prelims back and go, maybe I should change, or, okay, let's pick up extension 2. So it swings either way as well. But also note that you can also change maths courses in year 12. I've had a few students myself recently drop from maths advanced to maths standard as well. So never too late, only just be mindful of any HSC cutoff windows. Okay, here's a bit of further information as to what you study in each of the courses. Won't go into too much detail, but the short of it is that advanced and extension 1 are more calculus heavy as well, problem heavy as well in terms of functions and trigonometry too. Standard is a lot more, I guess, just application based, and some of trigonometry is also done in standard, but just to a much easier difficulty. Advanced extension 1 are very much, backbone of it is calculus, which flows into a lot of topics such as even statistical analysis, believe it or not, as well. So harder topics there as well. Extension 2, again, just a step up from extension 1, also calculus heavy with further integration and mechanics. Do this thing called complex numbers, so introduce a whole new system of numbers as well. So what math subject should you pick? Once again, as we've consistently been discussing today, I'm going to keep reinforcing this throughout today. Don't just choose a math subject because of scaling, okay? Once again, you need to be performing strong in that cohort for you to scale well and have the benefits of that. If you're not good at maths, it's not your strong suit, maybe you're a bit more of a, English humanities person, like my sister is, perfect. Perhaps Maths Standard 2 is your gig. Maybe Maths Standard 1 if your ATAR isn't a priority, or that's unlikely. And once again, don't be roped into doing extension subjects like my extension 1 cohort, just because everyone else was doing it or because that was deemed to be prestigious. Okay, let's talk a little bit about sciences. And I'll squeeze this in 3 minutes to allow some time just for some questions. And then, 2 minutes now. I'll also stay back on today's call if anyone wanted to have a bit of a chat as well. So now looking at science as well, here's a snapshot of how each of the science subjects scale, chemistry coming out as the highest scaling subject amongst the sciences. You'll note with biology, previously it did scale better, but once again, the cohort, which is what determines scaling, this became a lot broader in terms of student ability and has since pulled biology scaling back. Science extension is relatively strong as well. Then earth and environmental science and investigating science, not as much. Science content is shown there for chemistry, physics, and biology. There's the year 12 content as well. Once again, biology is a lot more content heavy than physics and chemistry, whereas physics, chemistry are a lot more calculation based. So a lot better for students who are more interested in maths. Oh, did science quite quickly. Economics, this one I'll park to one side for the purpose of today. We'll also share these slides afterwards as well. But the gist of economics is that economics is also a very, very practical subject that you might want to consider, particularly if you like a bit of a blend of humanities and a bit of maths. It's great for a number of university courses. So a number of university economics courses require a lot of the content. It's also very practical as well. We've all been reading the media as well, and economics is a great subject from which to unpack what's going on in the world as well. So once again, for those of you who are sort of, okay, I don't mind a bit of science and maths, but also love my humanities, economics is probably your fit. You'll find it very, very interesting, and it also scales reasonably well. Okay, so I'm now I'll leave section 7 just showing scaling for other subjects as well. We didn't quite go through in that much detail. What I want to get through really is just the TLDR of today in terms of most important thing and then what to take forward moving on. So once again, we keep saying that year 10 is your opportunity to really get ahead and actually put in that foundation and those skills for doing better in years 11 and 12. Okay, so that's the first thing. And with year 10, it is very much put in the foundation now, English, maths, work out what you're good at, and year 11 becomes a lot easier. We do have program information, but I did want to skip to the honours closing for today. So that's the first thing. Year 10 matters, okay, but importantly with all this information today, it's important to put the HSC in a broader context as well. Yes, HSC is high stress. What can minimise that stress? Having a support network and also making the right choices as well. And the biggest thing by far is very much getting that foundation right in terms of what subjects you want. Not choosing subjects just because of scaling, but because you can perform well in them. Choosing something related to your interests, planning ahead to, okay, maybe I might want to do economics or business at university and working backwards. There's nothing worse than doing something in your HSC or even university courses, as some of my peers have found out, doing something that you resent and being compelled to keep doing that because you feel like you have to. All of today is very much about setting time aside to go, what do I need to get there, and then planning ahead from there. Okay, so on that, I did want to leave some time for questions. I've got a few, but once again, I'll hang back. Thank you all so much for joining. Once again, any questions, feel free to unmute or pop them in the chat. We will circulate these here. I'll just await any questions unmuted or in the chat from anyone here. No questions. All right, well, that concludes today's subject selection seminar. Apologies for not having lots of time to do Q&A. That said, feel free to hang on, hang back in the call. I will continue to hang back as well. Thank you very much for coming. Hope you got something out of today. If you do have any further questions that come up, here is my email. Reach out to me personally. I'll even give you a buzz if needed. More than happy to set aside some time just to go through things with you, and if you need a bit of help with choosing subjects as well, come my way. Once again, thanks so much. Have a lovely and warm evening. It is quite brutal out there, and hope to see you all around. Thank you, Liana. Thank you, Isabel. Thank you, Sophia. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Shalini. Thank you, Mina. Thank you, Hassan. Have a lovely evening. Jacqueline Bainers, do we have any questions or anything? Jacqueline, any questions?